Welcome to your College Bound Kid
podcast for parents and families everywhere.
Whether you have kids that plan to attend college or you have current college students, you want them in and you want them to graduate.
And you want a quality education that prepares you for the jobs of today and the jobs of tomorrow. I am Mark Stucker, and I'm a college coach.
And I'm Anika Madden, and I'm a parent. It is Thursday, January 24th, and welcome to episode number 52, Test Prep, Online, One-on-One, or Group. In this week's news, a tale of two institutions, Amherst and Wisconsin, take education down different paths. And we're in chapter 52 of 171 answers, and we're talking through whether your child would do better with online, one-on-one, or group test prep. And this week's question is from a student who wants to know if his college counselor is the person that'll be sending off his test scores to his colleges. And Mark welcomes back Miss Elaine Griffin Rubin. You may remember Elaine. She's the senior contributor and communication specialist with Edvisors. And they're walking through the 9 different federal loan repayment options.
Anika, I have a question for you. Do you remember the first time when Jalen took a long drive with his car?
No, because I've deleted that out my memory.
Long would be like Atlanta to Davidson, like right 4 or 5 hours.
No,
how did you?
I've blocked that out.
Oh, I was gonna say, how did you handle it?
I'm sure I didn't do it well because I didn't remember. I don't remember it.
Yeah, because Joy got her license on December 26th. And she drove 4 hours back to college today. I was a nervous wreck. I was calling her every 10 minutes.
As you should.
Thank God she made it there safely. Let's turn to college hot topics in the news.
In this week's news, Mark, this week's article entitled A Tale of Two Institutions, Amherst and Wisconsin Take Education Down Different Paths. This is found in Forbes and is written by Mr. Willard Dix. And Mr. Dix is highlighting 2 very distinct trends in schools. The first one being the small private liberal arts college that just really embraces students to, or encourages students to take on a liberal arts education where you value clear and thoughtful thinking and communicating and deepen their understanding of the world and how it works. And the second type of institution that he highlights is the large public institution that basically shares off the arts and language and history and all that. And they solely focus on what would be considered pragmatic or what leads to a job, basically, and to meet market needs. So what Mr. Dix did, Mark, is that he chose Amherst College and the University of Wisconsin to draw these distinctions, beginning with Amherst as launching a $625 million capital campaign to support a new interdisciplinary science center. And it's so the center is poised to enhance its historic excellence in the humanities, arts, and social sciences, where in contrast, the University of Wisconsin made a $1 million matching gift deal with the Foxconn Technology Group. And their goal is to fund topics deemed valuable to advance the technology hub itself, making the university a pipeline for research and engineering talent for the company. Now, his intent, Mr. Dix, with this article is to draw attention to the differences in the views of higher education's purpose. One being the creation of individuals with the capacity for wide-ranging thought versus the creation of worker bees for the industry. Now, Mark, clearly came across to me as biased to the liberal arts, as he boasts. He was really boasting, the Amherst campaign, and that was ultra clear, right? But I absolutely see the value in having both. To me, mostly to satisfy preference among millions of unique individuals. So what say you, Mark Stucker?
I think we agree 100% based on what you said because, first of all, I don't know if you know this, but Willard Dix was an admission officer at Amherst because you tell a little bias.
Just a smidge.
Just a smidge. But one thing I really appreciated was his forceful and passionate advocacy for a liberal arts education because nowadays liberal arts education is just constantly assailed and pilloried, and it's not right. What you gain in that environment is invaluable, where you question assumptions and You learn how to communicate and write and speak clearly, and it's interdisciplinary, and it's it prepares you because you have such a deeper understanding of how the world works that it really does prepare you for the jobs of the future. But there's such a focus, I feel, on vocational and job training, job specific education that the liberal arts go neglected. So I did appreciate that, even if it's an overcorrection to make a point, because I want my kids taking sociology and history and political science and philosophy and psychology and the arts. It makes them well-rounded. It makes them interesting, and it makes them excellent critical thinkers. So I so appreciate that. And nowadays, I like this emphasis on STEM, Anika, and STEAM, but to me, it's almost gone overboard. So it's one thing to say that there are lots of opportunities in STEM. I would be the first to say that. I say that all the time to people. For those who don't know what we're talking about, STEM is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, and math. And so oftentimes you'll hear, oh, you got to go into STEM. That's where all the jobs are. And there are lots of opportunities. We just talked about a couple weeks ago when we talked about 3 key skills necessary for the future. And one of them was technological competence, right? But there were also the soft skills too, and the critical thinking and the analysis that you get in the liberal arts. So oftentimes it's presented as a binary choice, and one or the other. And so why I said we agree 100% is I agree with you. Like there's a place for both. But what I oftentimes hear with STEM is, oh, you should go into STEM because if you don't go into a STEM job, good luck working at Starbucks at 35. Like, I mean, that's how it's presented. Like, or living out of your parents' basement at 42.
Right.
That's how it's presented, and
we don't want, by the way. Which we don't want.
And so I see a place for both. I really, really, really see a place for both. I'm not anti-vocational training at all. There's a place for that, but I'd like to see it supplemented with the liberal arts because I think it makes you more well-rounded. I'm a little hypocritical here because if I was a student going back to school, I would not have liked some of the more rigid curriculums like Columbia. Your first 2 years are pretty standard curriculum at Columbia. University of Chicago's got a pretty set core curriculum as well. But I have so much respect for them because what they're doing is they're making sure that all their students are exposed to all of the disciplines so that they'll be really, really well-rounded. And so, yes, there was some boosterish behavior on his part and bias for Amherst, his alma mater. And a little bit, it made it sound like it was the best school in the world. It was a little bit over the top. And I felt at times he was perhaps a little critical of the vocational training because he said one option results in making you a worker bee, like you're just an automaton. Right. So I thought that was a little. Exactly. I thought that was a little pejorative. But one thing he did say, and I did appreciate a lot, was he said, and I'll actually quote from the article here. He said, while the University of Wisconsin has to deal with an increasing hostile state government, like many other state governments, that's been starving its higher education system of financial resources, forcing it to find money where it can. So it's hard to blame the university for doing what it thinks it needs to be done. So I did appreciate him saying that. Basically, we've talked about this before, how states are cutting back their state appropriations and families having to pay more money, and therefore it's putting more pressure on people to say, what kind of job am I going to get if I come out of pocket like this? Right. So I did appreciate that balance, but I thought it was great because it was a very well articulated defense of the liberal arts education. I just thought, you don't have to do what I see the STEM crowd or the vocational crowd do, which is diminish the other one.
Right. I'll take both.
Yeah. But he's right. Like education is sort of going those two directions. So I thought he laid the case out nicely. So that's why I thought it was a good article for us to talk about.
Sounds good.
Hopefully it wasn't a snoozer for our listeners.
I don't think so. Now it's time for our step-by-step walkthrough of the college admissions process.
Okay, friends. We are in chapter 52 of a book I wrote called 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions. It's one of our last questions we're getting on test prep. We just have a few left on the test prep subject. And this is a common question I get, which is it better to do online test prep, one-on-one test prep, or group test prep? And really, you can add a fourth one in here, Nico, which is online group, right? Online group,
Right.
which is what Janae, I think, is going to be doing. So, just a little background. I have worked with multiple test prep companies and work with a bunch now. I've had official partnerships with Kaplan, with Revolution Prep, Appleroot, Test Innovators, Math SP, Success Prep, just to name a few. And back in 2011, I had did you ever know Daniel DiPiazza? Did you know him? I don't know if you knew Dan.
Yes, I did.
You remember
Game
Dan?
changer.
Yeah, well, Daniel worked full time for me for a year, just doing test prep.
I remember that.
Yeah. He went home to home and he was amazing until he moved to California. He was fantastic. So I have a lot of experience with this, and well, you know what? I'm about to dive right in. What are your thoughts on the chapter? See, I'm so anxious to get into it. Tell me your thoughts, and then I'll let you know mine.
Well, first of all, Janae is in the group online test prep class. She started a few weeks ago.
Good.
Yeah, and I'll say that this one specifically is so far so good. She's like, oh, it's okay, but that's Janae, right? And but this teacher, she's really good because she sends us like sample videos from sessions of the class, which I really appreciate. But either way, so you clearly state, and I totally agree, that there's no doubt that one-on-one test prep will yield the best outcome for any kid, like probably 9 times out of 10, right? But we also know that that's probably the most expensive. However, my big, huge, massive takeaway from all this was doing the combination of both. Like, man, that is complete genius. Like, I don't know why I always think of these things like it's either one way or the other. Like, is that just like a natural default with parents? Like, oh, you got to do this or you got to do that.
No, I think people don't know. I think first of all, let's explain to people a combination of both. I think that's confusing. So, there's different variations of it. One of the companies I worked with, they call it their 6-pack, which I think is kind of funny, kind of a little play off a beer there. But so the way that works is you're in a group and you get the group instruction. And what the group instruction does is it significantly lowers your cost. And allows you to cover a lot of the general things that you need to kind of know anyway. But then you go into your 6 hours of one-on-one, which is concentrated and focused on your individual child's needs. Another one of the companies I work with does a 4-hour, and then some of them customize it. So that is a fantastic bang for your buck. Now, there are some people, Anika, and I'm glad you said 90%, not 100, because there are people that do better in group. There's some people that just play. The interaction motivates them, and the stimulation motivates them.
Right.
And so the bottom line really is this is individual. There are students that do better one-on-one. There's students that's all they need is one-on-one. One of the students I was talking with that I worked with this year, I was actually trying to convince her to get into some individual test prep, and she pushed back on me, some group test prep, and she pushed back on me and said, well, if I'm in the group, they're not always going to be talking about exactly what my needs are. But if I do my own, I can customize everything to where my needs are. And you know what? And I called her back, and I pushed back on her. And then I called her later that day. I said, you know what, Alexia, you're totally right. Because of the kind of learner she is. Like, some people are that disciplined and they can teach themselves. Other people need a teacher to teach them, and they need the accountability and the structure. This is where you really have to know your kid. So all 4 of if I laid out all 4, one-on-one, group, online, group online, or let's throw the 5th, combo, all of them have their place. All of them have their place. Now, one thing you said, it is true. And just Friday, I had lunch with one of the test prep partners. They do test prep work for both Kip and for me privately. They do great work, and we had lunch. They treated me to a really nice restaurant, by the way. That was nice. But anyway, let me stop thinking about that salmon and get back to what I'm talking about here. But I got into a conversation with them, and I asked them what their average score gains are. right? Obviously, it's average. It's an average. It can vary from, we know what averages are. And every single time I've ever done those with every test prep company I've ever worked with, Anika, the largest score gains do come one-on-one. Right? So they gave me the average gains one-on-one versus group. And it also depends a little bit on the time. Okay. 12 hours versus 24 hours. And maybe this is an obvious question, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. Why would the greatest gains be one-on-one?
Because it's pretty darn personalized and custom, and you're solely focused on that one student and meeting them where their needs are directly instead of having to vet a whole bunch of kids.
Yeah, it's a combination of two things. You can completely customize everything exactly to what the needs of that student is, right? And then the other thing is the level of accountability.
Right.
Like good luck hiding and explaining away or trying to get away with not doing your homework assignment. Good luck with that one. So if people can afford it, I am going to recommend that they either do one-on-one or they do a combination of group and some individual hours. If people can afford it, it is a good return on people's investment. However, there are kids that don't need it.
Right.
You know, I've had students. I had at least 2 students this year that got close to perfect scores without anything other than doing it on their own.
Wow.
So some people just, and we've talked about this before. These are people that have been preparing their whole life.
Right.
There's something else I want to say, Anika. This is getting off this subject a little bit, but I've been wanting to say this every single time we've talked about test prep, and I haven't said it yet. So we're running out of test prep episodes, so I want to get it in. One of the things that helps a lot with scores? Getting rid of your smartphone. Not, controlling your phone. Because nowadays kids are on their phone hours and hours and hours when they could be, reading or doing math problems and things. Minimizing your level of phone activity as well as your TV activity. Those things help. And the other thing is using your summers wisely for academic enrichment. So I just had to throw that in there. Maybe it didn't neatly fit in here, but I've been meaning to say it for the last 6 weeks. And I had to find a place to push it in there.
No, because it minimizes the need, right? Like if you're doing all what you can on your own, then that minimizes the cost and the time that you'll have to invest in somebody helping you with the darn test prep. Like that's the reality. And
developing your mind.
Good luck telling Janaea to put down that darn smartphone. I've tried it, and I'm not trying it again.
Know.
It's just, I just choose my battles.
It's like the Civil War. It's like you pick your battles. That's like World War III, right? I guarantee you're not the only parent out there that would say that.
Pick your world war.
Yes. Oh, Anika, I do want to say one more thing about group. This is important. So if I'm working with a student and let's say it's ACT, SAT, either one, and if their scores are either below the national averages, at the national average, or just a little above the national average, and we've said before, ACT, that's like a 20.9, SAT around 1060 to 1080. I give a range because there's a difference between there's a higher score average for people who actually go to college versus people who actually take the test. So those students oftentimes benefit a lot more starting out in group, right? If a student is coming in with really high scores, like one of my juniors just took a practice test. A couple of my juniors just took a practice test. One got a 730 on their evidence-based reading or writing. That's a high score. And another just took a practice test and got a 1390, 1380. That's a pretty high score too. Just first time taking it as a junior.
Wow.
So when your scores are, pretty high like that, a lot of times if you go into group, a lot of what they're covering you may already know. So group is like if your score is like in the SAT, ACT, let's say it's like a 25 or lower on an ACT, or like low 600s or lower on an SAT, a lot of times group is going to be great because so many things are going to talk about you need to know anyway.
Right. Yeah.
But if you're up into the 700s or the 30s in the ACT right away, a lot of times you're just going to be better off having something tailored to you. Does that make sense?
It does. Perfecto sense.
It's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Mark, this week's question is from a student, Mr. Alex in Manhattan. And Alex wants to know, does my high school counselor send my test scores to the colleges on my college list?
I'm about to be test scored out. We have a lot of test score questions. No, this is a great question. And I had two students this year who they didn't submit their test scores. And they got notifications from schools like, hey, we're missing your scores. And I'm like, well, why don't you get them from my school counselor? And the thinking was, and it kind of makes some sense initially, well, my school counselor is sending over the school profile. The school counselor is sending over the transcript. The school counselor is sending over a counselor rec. Why wouldn't they just send my test scores? But that is not the school's responsibility. That is your responsibility. And here's why it doesn't make sense for the school to do it. First of all, there's a good chance the school doesn't even have your scores. Did you send them to the school from the ACT or the college board so that they have them? Secondly, people are always adding schools and changing schools. So every single time you add a school or delete a school, how's the school to know to send them? So for some people, this may be an obvious question. Yeah, of course I send them, but it actually isn't. And so I thought it would be worthwhile just to make it clear. No, it is your responsibility to send your scores. Now, I like for people, both the ACT and the SAT each give you 4 free score reports, right? In most instances, it's best for you to get the scores back yourself, look at them over because of score choice, which we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago. That's most schools practice. Figure out whether or not you want to send this set of scores or not, especially if you're going to take the test twice. What are you thinking, Anika?
No. Could the counselor send the scores? Could they partner with the counselor? Like, hey, can you help me with this and send the scores?
So here's what I'll say. There are times when this gets complicated here, but let's try to dive into it. There's times when the scores are actually on the official transcript. Some schools put their test scores on the official transcript, but here's the other thing. Some colleges will accept the scores if they're come from the school on the official transcripts. But not every school does that, so you have to know each school's policy. Just like remember when we talked about how sometimes you can self-report your own scores, and that's a growing trend? So some schools allow that, some don't. Some schools allow scores to be on the transcript, some don't. Most schools don't put scores on transcripts because there's some coordination involved in that.
Yes, it is complicated. Thank you.
Yeah, but the bottom line, what's the bottom line? What's the takeaway? What's the takeaway we want?
You make sure you send your own darn scores. It is not the counselor's responsibility to send your scores off. They will not be sent if you don't send them.
Yes. Yeah, you should not assume that because most schools don't put them on their transcripts and not every school even accepts them when they are. By the way, Anika, you know what I was looking?
Wow.
We're not 100% done the test prep questions, but we're done talking about it this way because the next couple of weeks we're talking about test optional schools. That's kind of different.
Oh, and excellent.
And then I'm going to be happy because I don't think we have another test prep question for the next month. I'm test prepped out.
Don't say the TP word anymore after this, folks, please.
Friends, if you heard episode 32 and 33, you know you're in for a treat because we had Elaine Griffin Rubin on back then talking about financial matters, and she was fantastic. So we have invited her back, and the subject is going to be a great one. There are 9 different options when it comes to repaying student loans, and most people don't know what those options are, and nor do they know which one is best in your unique circumstance. And that's what we're going to talk about over the next 3 weeks. So listen and enjoy part 1 of my interview with Elaine Griffin Rubin on repayment options for student loans.
And now, this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, if you heard episode 32 and 33, you know we had Elaine Griffin Rubin on from Edvisors, and we are blessed to have her back again. So welcome to your College Bound Kid, Elaine.
Thank you. It's great to be back, Mark.
So last time Elaine gave more of a fuller description of her background. You can go back and listen to that if you missed those episodes. But now I'd love for you to just talk a little bit more about your work initially at the Department of Education, sort of what you learned there, and sort of how it translates to what you're doing now.
So working at the department, it was definitely an experience. Last time, I think I shared a little bit about how I started with the Nationwide Guarantee Agency. And I did regulatory analyst work there. So I think that really prepared me in general for the financial aid world. But when I moved to the department, I had a totally different perspective. Now I'm on the inside of, the governing body. I'm actually seeing why certain things are done a certain way. I'm seeing process flows. I'm seeing how everything kind of works together to get the end result of, having money being dispersed to students and, helping with financial aid, helping with repayment. So it was a totally different perspective. What I really learned out of it is a lot of tips and tools and ways I can help the public essentially get through the process. Maybe some of the best contact numbers, maybe some of the best questions you should be asking, and also being able to identify some problems because we saw a lot of them just coming in from, everybody. I mean, this is an agency that works with thousands of schools nationwide, tens of thousands of students, handles billions, trillions of dollars. So it was a totally different perspective to kind of see everything coming into one agency. So it was very valuable, I think. And it definitely prepared me for my next role where I am now as senior contributor and communications specialist at Edvisors, because I saw some of the problems. I saw some of the gaps that the public has with these programs. And my job here is to really develop some engaging content, easily digestible content around the world of financing a higher education. So that's a little bit of why I think working there was so great and how it has helped me so much translate those skills I learned into what I do now to try to make great content for Edvisors, come up with some great blogs and other ways to present materials.
Thank you for that. And just so you know, listeners, especially for those of you who like to sort of visualize things, so Elaine is in Las Vegas, and it's hot there, okay? She's in Las Vegas, and I'm in Atlanta, and it's also hot, but that's where we're doing this interview from today. And, we had a great planning meeting. I love talking to Elaine because literally we can talk about any subject on the area of financial aid, and she has such command of that subject that there's pretty much nothing that we could not have her come on and speak as an expert to. But what we want to talk about today, and our subject for today, is what are the repayment options that students have, and in some cases even parents, particularly for federal loans, because students don't realize what their options are. And some of these options are going to make a big difference for you and your lifestyle. So that's going to be our subject today. And Elaine, why don't you start off by talking about what's called the standard repayment plan? Let us know, what that plan is, and when would you recommend someone utilize the standard repayment plan?
Yeah, so repayment options is really one of those benefits. When everyone's talking about all the benefits of the federal loans and why they're so great and maybe why you should look at those first before you look at other options, it's because you have so many options for a repayment, meaning you can kind of adjust your payments based on what you need to basically survive in other aspects of your life. So that's a great benefit that we have here. And the standard one, especially, is the best place to start because this is the one most people are familiar with. Because if you didn't choose a repayment plan when you entered repayment, this is the one you'll automatically be placed in. And the thing with this plan, it tends to be the better option if you can afford it and you can afford other needs that you have in your life. But essentially what this plan does is it takes your loan balance, and it calculates a fixed monthly payment, meaning it's not going to change, to ensure that your loan is repaid within 10 years. So it's cheaper overall. It's overall the cheapest way to repay your loan because 10 years means you're not having that much accruing interest. You're paying a decent amount every month, and it's one of the ones that you pay it off the quickest. So if you can afford it, I always recommend people to try to stick with it. It can be a lot, but if you can afford the other needs in your life, then I always try to encourage people to stay with it. But, it's got the benefit you're done in 10 years.
Yeah, and that's very, very important. I'm really glad you started out by underscoring that this is why we emphasize Stafford loan, federal direct student loan, subsidized or unsubsidized. That should always be your first loan. And in a lot of cases, I believe for students, that should be your only loan. Like if you can't afford to fund your education without that, maybe you need to look at a different option. But I really, really, really hope everybody caught that, as we don't want people doing private loans before you would do this loan. And it's largely because of all these flexibilities that you have. Elaine, why don't you give a scenario about how much somebody could expect to pay back? Let's say somebody did the maximum federal direct undergraduate loan of $27,000 for 4 years, or I guess $31,000 if they stayed an additional year. If they did the standard payment, I know you can't say precisely because the new interest rates come out once a year and they change, right? But it's because it's actually more than one loan. But approximately what would they be looking at in terms of a monthly payment? I think people can kind of get a handle around that when we talk in terms of numbers like that.
Yeah, so one of the standards that we kind of use to explain and give an idea, which is, disclaimered, not accurate based on your situation and interest rate and loan and all those kind of things. The one that we use a lot is for every $10,000 that you're borrowing, your monthly payment's going to be $120. So with some simple math, if you are taking out $20,000, you can multiply that number by 2. So it's $240 a month. When you get in closer to 30, you can multiply it again and can keep going and going. So essentially, that is what the standard is for a quick explanation and a quick understanding of what you're undertaking with that amount.
That's good.
Is that $120 for every $10,000 you're borrowing?
That's helpful. And but listeners, remember there were a couple of disclaimers out there because there are a couple of factors that can alter that. So don't come after Elaine if you take this loan out and it's like, why am I 121? So
yeah, this is a very disclaimered, estimate out there based on some pretty standard estimates with no other things happening. No accumulated interest, no capitalization, all that stuff. That could be a whole other episode.
But it's helpful for people. I really do think it's helpful just to at least, okay, I kind of get a sense. So if I take $10,000 in loans, I'm probably looking at about $12,000. So let's talk about the next one, which is on, fairly common as well, the extended repayment plan. Why don't you share with our listeners what this plan is, how it works, and who you think this is a good loan for?
Okay, so the extended repayment plan actually extends your repayment term. So when we talk about a repayment term in this world, we always go to the standard 10-year term. And that's what we're kind of basing it off of. But when you extend that term, now we're looking at a 25-year repayment plan. The thing about this plan is there is some eligibility requirements to get into it to begin with. Like you need to have at least $30,000 in a specific loan program, either the direct loan program, or if you're a borrower that's had loans for a while, maybe that federal family education loan program, but they have to be a bit exclusive. It has to be $30,000 in one of those buckets, not a combination of those two. And you have to, and once you're in it and you qualified, then a fixed monthly payment is determined to make sure that your loan is repaid within 25 years. So you can see how that would probably make your payment significantly less. It'll make it a smaller monthly payment. But by extending that term, you're allowing interest to keep accruing for a longer time. So overall, it's going to be a more expensive plan. By the time you're done, it's going to be significantly more expensive because you're more than doubling what the standard payment plan is. So this plan is only recommended for people who have high debt, who can't afford the monthly payment on the standard plan. However, there are other plans out there and available that might be a better option. And I know we're going to get into those a little bit later because they're kind of their own group. And those are known as the income-driven repayment plans. But maybe if you don't qualify for those for whatever reason, maybe this plan can help you with your monthly payments. But keep in mind, you're going to be in repayment for 25 years. That's a very long time. And you're going to pay a lot more overall because you've allowed interest to accrue with that. So that's a little bit about that extended repayment plan.
And friends, we're going to get into the weeds a little bit on this episode, but it's important because we really want you to understand the nuances and some of the complexities of these different plans. From my experience, most people do not know. Most people with loans, with federal loans, don't know about these plans. And I was having a conversation, Elaine, with some of the people I work with, and I was mentioning that I was going to be interviewing. They're like, when can I listen? I have to know this stuff, because these were people with considerable loan balances. So when they found out there was maybe some ways of making it a little easier, they were all ears. So just bear with us, listeners, as we get into the weeds a little bit. But, I do have a question for you, Elaine. I know that a lot of teachers and educators that work in public schools and other federal jobs are eligible potentially for public service loan forgiveness if they stay in that role for 10 years. So in that case, would you recommend that someone not do the standard repayment plan because they would not have any opportunity to have their loan discharged through public service loan forgiveness, whereas if they went to something like an extended plan or maybe an income-driven plan, they would pay less, and then they could have the rest of the loan balance discharged? What are your thoughts on that?
So here's the thing with public service loan forgiveness, and I'm really happy you brought that up, because I know a lot of people try to use that as a strategy to help pay off especially larger loan balances that are out there, especially for someone like a teacher or anybody else who might have a high debt to income ratio there. So here's the thing. That public service loan forgiveness program is a program that's available, but it does have a lot of things that a borrower has to do to make sure they're on the right track for forgiveness. Now, basically, that forgiveness option is 120 payments made under an eligible repayment plan while employed full-time in an eligible employer. So that's the basic of that. We can get really into PSLF, as we say it for short, because it's got a long title. But we can get into that later if we need to. But that's essentially what you need to do. But the eligible repayment plans are going to be your standard repayment plan and your income-driven repayment plan. So you're not going to have an option to use that extended repayment plan or the graduated repayment plan, which we haven't touched on quite yet. Those aren't going to count as eligible payments. So you can't use that.
That was great.
So the whole thing with the standard plan, like you pointed out, if it's a 10-year plan, that's 120 payments. You'd have nothing to forgive. The strategy here is actually to use an income-driven repayment plan. And if you were in a standard plan for a few months, those payments will count towards those 120 payments, so you can use them in combination. But the ideal way to maximize your forgiveness with something like PSLF is to use it with an income-driven repayment plan and not solely the standard plan, because that's not going to give you anything to forgive at the end.
So Elaine, you're good at this. Let's call it a tease for our listeners, so they stay all the way to the end, so they hear about the income-driven plans. Because how can they not want to hear them after you set it up like that? So, but you,
I know, so exciting.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
The recommended resource for episode 52 is the College Affordability Guide. And you can access the College Affordability Guide by just simply going to collegeaffordabilityguide.org. Now, the College Affordability Guide analyzes over 10 million data points from thousands of colleges and universities across the country to find which colleges are doing the most to make high quality education affordable. They have a great section on online college, a great section on co-op programs, on colleges on a budget, on colleges to be careful about. They have a great section on paying for graduate school and on transferring credits. All of those are under their guides tab. And here's a little bit more information about the guide. This is their approach or their mission. Our mission is to bring together disparate bodies of data to produce a more holistic but also focused view of which colleges are likely to be the best value for the money. We end up with one number, an affordability score, with two main parts, a getting in score and a getting out score. We use these two measures because we think that most of the resources about college affordability focus too narrowly on the cost of getting into college. We think it's just as important to look at what happens when you get out. Do students get out with degrees, or do they drop out halfway through with a bunch of credits they still owe money for? And once they've gotten out, are they able to repay their student loans? So the recommended resource for episode 52 is the College Affordability Guide. Now return to my interview with Elaine Griffin Rubin. And you also did mention the graduated repayment plan. So let's talk about that as our third plan and explain that to our listener and how that works.
Okay, so the graduated repayment plan is a little bit different than your standard and your extended repayment plan because the payments actually start a little bit lower and they increase over time, usually about every 2 years, and your repayments term stays to that 10-year repayment term. So this plan is great for somebody who's just starting out, like many college graduates are, and maybe, they're getting some more entry-level type jobs, but they expect to grow in the next 10 years. They went to college and that was their whole goal, is to start in a field and make a name for themselves and make a decent income with that as well. So this still lets you hit that goal of repaying it within 10 years, but it gives you a little bit of a break at the beginning that your monthly payment is going to be a little bit less and it'll increase over time. Great plan for somebody who expects to have an increasing income, but maybe they can't afford that standard amount right off the bat. It's a little bit more expensive than your 10-year standard repayment plan because if you're making a lower payment, you're not paying down that principal very quickly. It's going to take you a little bit longer to, pay off any outstanding interest and then start hitting the principal. So because of that type of background math, it is a little bit more expensive. And there's one thing I want to note with the three plans we've already touched on: the graduated, the extended, and the standard repayment plan. And actually, mostly the standard and the graduated. I will take back my words a little bit. These plans tend to show up with this 10-year term when we're talking about non-consolidated loans. You might see some of these terms when you consolidate, but you might notice that your repayment's actually going to be for 30 years instead of the 10 years I keep talking about. And that's just because these type of plans are also offered for consolidation loans, but they take into account your total education debt to determine your total repayment term, which could be anywhere from 10 to 30 years. So just a little side note on that. So if you do see that and you see that and you think that it's the 10-year term and, the payment's a lot less, probably not. Generally, you'll see two numbers there: the 10-year standard repayment term and maybe the one that extends out depending on your total education debt. And another note with that standard consolidation repayment plan that's not 10 years, those payments will not count towards PSLF if that's something you're looking to use or utilize in the future. So you have to be with that 10-year standard repayment amount for those payments to count, or that IDR plan.
Okay, so a couple of things. One, I think it was helpful for our listeners when you said if you borrow $10,000, in general, you're going to expect to pay about an extra 20% back, and $20,000, the same thing. For these other plans, let's say the graduated and the extended. Let's say somebody borrowed $30,000 for undergraduate. Around how much would they have to pay initially, just to give a sense to our listener about what they'd be looking at for repayment and how it would change? Well, with the graduated, it would change, right? So
All right, so that's a great question to get an idea of what happens to that payment as you start looking at other repayment plans. So if you got about $30,000 in loans, give or take, disclaimer, generally you're looking at a graduated repayment plan that might start with payments maybe closer to about $200 that would increase over time to over about $550. So it sounds like a lot, but in some ways you're getting that break up front and you expect to be able to afford a higher payment to get rid of that debt within the time that you would like to. An extended repayment plan, we're extending out that term and it's probably going to be half, if not a little bit less than, your extended repayment plan. Yep. Your extended repayment plan is what we're looking at next. And it's pretty much going to be half or a little bit less of your standard plan. So if your standard plan with $30,000 is about $360-ish dollars, give or take, you're looking closer to maybe like $170, maybe somewhere between $150 and $170 a month. So it does make a difference on that monthly payment, but there are going to be impacts on the other end.
Thank you. And also, Elaine, you used the term consolidation when you were describing loans being eligible. Can you explain to our listeners what consolidating loans is? Because I think a lot of them may not be familiar with that.
So consolidation is an option for borrowers to take all their federal student loans. It's only if you want to stay with the federal loan program, you can only stick with federal student loans, and you're combining them into a new federal direct consolidation loan. So some people find benefits with this because it's one servicer, it's only one loan that they're paying back and maybe not 4 or 5. But there are some other sides of it because one of the things with the federal direct consolidation loan, it is not a refinance. I mean, I will say that flat out. It is not a refinance. There's no credit run. There's nothing in regards to that to determine a new interest rate. The way they determine an interest rate for a consolidation loan is they take the weighted average of all the underlying loans and they figure that out and then they round it up to the nearest 1/8%. So it actually could increase your interest rate overall a little bit. So that's just another repayment option or strategy out there. And sometimes people use it, especially if they have a Parent Plus loan, because it might qualify them to repay that loan with an income contingent repayment plan and maybe work towards the public service loan forgiveness type option. But generally, especially these days with some of the ways that the income driven plans work, it's sometimes not necessary to consolidate your loans and even have that slight increase in interest rate. But we can get into some of that stuff when we talk about some of those income-driven plans.
Great. Thanks, Elaine. Now, let's talk a little bit about the student that's in one type of loan repayment mode, and they're like, oh my goodness, this is not working for me. Are they stuck in that initial payment option, or are there options for them to switch? And if they switch, how do they go about switching?
So you're never stuck in your repayment plan, really. My biggest piece of advice is call your loan servicer. If you're in a repayment plan, say you're trying to stick it out with that 10-year repayment term and life happened, maybe you have a family now, other expenses, and you're really struggling to come up with the basic needs. And of course, I'm using the word needs over wants here. You're struggling to come up with some of those basic needs, and you need to find a way to make your loan payment manageable without maybe putting it in a forbearance or a deferment or anything, because those can, accrue interest, especially on those unsub loans. And, it can make the loan more expensive and delay how long it's going to take you to repay your loan. So my number one piece of advice, if you are having trouble repaying your student loan under your current repayment plan, is to call your loan servicer. And that's the organization that's sending you mail, email, making phone calls to you, especially if you've missed a payment or two. Reach out to them because you can talk to them about your specific scenario, what's going on. They can tell you based on your income and your situation what your payments will actually be. And then you can make an informed decision to help yourself get out of that tough spot.
Thank you for that. And listeners, you may have heard Elaine mention the term deferment and forbearance. So this is if you're in a jam, you lose your job, and you can't quite make payments for a while. That's another nice provision the federal government allows for, is the ability not to have your loan go into default right away and to actually postpone some payments for a while. But that could be a whole subject unto itself, Elaine. And maybe hint, I'll have to have you come back in a half a year or so and do a session for us on forbearance and deferment for our listeners, so we can get a good handle on that. But did I?
These are all separate topics that are coming up, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. But why do they have to make the money so complicated, right? Why can't it be simple?
Next week in the news, as students return to college, a basic question persists. What are they learning? And we'll be in chapter 53 of 171 answers, and it's all about why an increasing number of schools are not requiring standardized test scores these days. And next week's question is from a mom who wants to know how her child can know that the major she selects is going to lead to a job that she'll love and be good at. And Mark continues his interview with Elaine Griffin Rubin in part 2 of the 9 different federal loan repayment options.
You have a little bit of singing talent there. I saw a little rhythm there in the news. Did you ever sing in a choir or do any solos or anything?
Let me do it again, and I'll answer the question.
I was wondering, you castigated me when I tried to sing. I'm sitting here with the singing talent over here.
I just drank some Diet Pepsi. That's all it was.
Have a good week and try to avoid the snow.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. And if you found this podcast helpful, it would help us tremendously if you would subscribe and write us a review on your favorite podcast listening station. And please be sure to click the share button and send this to someone you know that could really use this information. Your College Bound Kid is produced by John Lockenbaugh. The amazing music that you hear is by Victor Allen Weeks. Artwork is by Andrea Togo, and marketing designs are by Kimberly Blass. If you want to get a copy of the book 171 Answers to the Most Asked College Admissions Questions, you can go right to 171answers.com. And if you want to have a college coaching session with Mark, you can send him a text to area code 404-664-4340.
And if you have a question or a few questions that you would like for us to answer on the show, please email us at questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. That's questions with an S at yourcollegeboundkid.com. Every week, we'll take one question and include it in the episode. We don't like your questions. We love your questions, so send them our way. And by the way, check out our website, which is just simply yourcollegeboundkid.com. Again, we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to meeting with you again next week.